The rain had been falling over Ashcombe Hall for 3 days, when the Duchess Eleanor Ashworth pressed her back against the cold stone of the east corridor and heard her husband's voice drift from the drawing-room like smoke under a door. "She warms my bed out of duty and my house out of necessity," the Duke of Ashcombe was saying, and there was a low laugh in his throat that Eleanor had not heard directed at her in the 2 years of their marriage. Warm, easy, a broodmare. Seraphina, nothing more. You needn't fear her. The woman's laughter answered his, silver and cruel. I do not fear her, Edmund. I pity her. That grey little creature, forever bent over her ledgers as though anyone will thank her for it. Eleanor did not move. She did not gasp, nor did her hand fly to her mouth as it might have in a novel written by someone who had never truly felt the floor go out from beneath them. She stood very still, the way a woman stands when she has just understood that the ground she believed solid was, in fact, water. Before you watch what she did in the 60 seconds that followed, because it was not weeping and it was not fleeing, and by the time she was finished, neither the Duke nor his mistress would ever again make the mistake of believing her a broodmare or a fool, press subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Because this is the kind of justice that deserves witnesses. To understand what she did, you must first understand what had been done to her. Eleanor Winthrop had been the eldest of 4 daughters, born to a country parson in Wiltshire, whose learning exceeded his living, and whose debts, upon his death, exceeded his learning. There had been no dowry to speak of, no connections beyond the modest respectability of a clergyman's name, and no expectation whatsoever that a Winthrop girl would marry a duke. But the Duke of Ashcombe's estate was drowning in debts of its own, gambling debts inherited and compounded, the kind that ate through great houses like damp through plaster, and his mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, had determined that what her son required was not another fortune-hunting beauty, but a woman of sense, thrift, and quiet obedience who would manage his household and bear his heirs and otherwise trouble no one with her presence. Eleanor, 22, plain by the standards of a ballroom, though not by any honest measure, and desperate to save her 3 younger sisters from the workhouse-adjacent fate of governessing in strangers' houses, had accepted the arrangement with her eyes open and her heart carefully, deliberately closed. She had not expected love. She had expected, at best, civility. What she received instead was something colder, a husband who treated her with the distant courtesy one extends to a useful piece of furniture, who dined with her perhaps twice a month, who had installed his mistress, the widowed Lady Seraphina Vane, in a cottage on the estate grounds not a mile from the house itself, with a discretion so thin it might as well have been an announcement in the London papers. The servants knew, the tenants knew. Even the vicar, Eleanor suspected, knew and prayed for her in a manner she found more humiliating than comforting. She had spent 2 years learning the precise geometry of Ashcombe Hall's corridors, so that she might avoid encountering Lady Seraphina's carriage on the drive, learning which hours the Duke kept, so that she might arrange never to require anything of him, learning, in short, how to make herself as small and as silent as the role assigned to her demanded. It was not the marriage she had dreamed of as a girl reading novels by candlelight in her father's rectory. But she had told herself, in the manner of women who must tell themselves such things to survive, that a roof over her sisters' heads and bread on their table was worth more than a foolish girlhood dream of being cherished. She had told herself this so often that she had very nearly come to believe it. What she had not anticipated, what no one at Ashcombe Hall had anticipated, least of all the Duke, was that a woman rendered invisible has a great deal of time to watch and to learn and to think. Josiah Vane, the estate's steward, and, as it happened, Lady Seraphina's late husband's cousin, had been engaged some 6 years prior by the old Duke, Edmund's father, and had remained in his post through the transition. It was Vane who managed the tenant rents, Vane who kept the ledgers, Vane who reported the estate's health or its decline too, a duke who had never in his life been taught to read a column of figures with any real understanding, having been raised instead to inherit rather than to labour. Eleanor, by contrast, had spent her girlhood keeping her father's parish accounts, stretching a curate's stipend across 6 mouths, learning arithmetic not as an ornament, but as a survival skill. It was this, more than any natural cleverness, that first drew her eye to the strange small irregularities that began to surface in the household accounts within a year of her marriage. A payment here to a tenant farm that Eleanor knew from her own quiet walks about the estate had stood empty since spring. A charge there for repairs to the north granary that she had seen with her own eyes remained unrepaired, its roof still sagging under last winter's snow. Small sums a careless woman, or a woman kept deliberately careless, would never have noticed. But Eleanor Winthrop had not been raised careless whatever her husband believed of her, and she began, in the privacy of her own small sitting-room, to keep a second set of figures, not the estate's official ledger, which Vane guarded as jealously as a dragon guards gold, but her own quiet reckoning, drawn from what she observed with her own eyes on her own walks, cross-referenced against what the household accounts, which did pass briefly through her hands as mistress of the house, claimed to be true. She told no one. There was, after all, no one to tell. Her husband did not solicit her opinions on the estate. He had made it perfectly clear, in the particular silence with which he received any attempt she made at conversation touching on matters beyond the household linens, that her province ended at the kitchen door. And so Eleanor kept her suspicions to herself and her numbers in a locked drawer, and continued to play the role of the quiet, grey, dutiful Duchess that everyone at Ashcombe Hall had decided she was. But quiet women, when finally provoked past the point of endurance, are not always as harmless as they have been taken for. The first true ally Eleanor found at Ashcombe Hall was not a person of consequence. Bramwell, the housekeeper, a stout, sharp-eyed widow who had served 3 generations of the family and who had watched Eleanor's quiet suffering with the particular tenderness of a woman who recognized it because she had lived something like it herself. It was Mrs. Bramwell who first mentioned, in the careful, sideways manner of servants who wish to warn their mistress without appearing to gossip, that Mistress Bramwell, Vane's cousin, had lately taken a fine new bonnet from London, and a new carriage besides, on wages that ought scarcely to have covered her cottage rent. It was Mrs. Breger, Bramwell too, who quietly arranged for Eleanor to speak, under the pretence of a charitable errand, with several of the tenant families, whose rents had lately been raised on Vane's authority, raised, they said, on the Duke's express orders, though the Duke, when Eleanor delicately tested the matter over one of their rare shared breakfasts, professed to know nothing of any increase at all. "I have made no such order," he said, frowning slightly over his newspaper, in a tone that suggested the topic bored him more than it concerned him. "Vane manages these things. I have no head for figures and no patience for tenant complaints. See that it is dealt with, if it troubles you so." It was the longest conversation they had shared in a month, and it told Eleanor 2 things with equal clarity: that her husband trusted his steward with a carelessness that bordered on wilful blindness, and that he regarded her own diligence, when she dared display a flicker of it. She thanked him with the composure she had trained herself to wear like armour, and returned to her locked drawer and her quiet figures and her growing certainty that something at Ashcombe Hall was very wrong indeed. It was in the autumn of her second year as Duchess that Eleanor found the letter. She had not been searching for it. She had gone to the estate office on a rainy afternoon to retrieve a receipt for a charitable subscription she had, in one of her small private rebellions, begun funding out of her own modest pin money, a subscription for the education of tenant children, which she had established quietly enough that even Vane had not thought to object. Assuming it beneath his notice, the office had been empty, Vane himself away in the village, and in reaching for a ledger on the high shelf, she had dislodged a folded paper tucked behind it, its wax seal broken, its handwriting unmistakably Vane's own, addressed not to any tenant or tradesman, but to Lady Seraphina Vane herself. She should not have read it. She read every word. It was not in itself a confession of theft. Vane was not so great a fool as to commit that to paper, but it spoke in the careful, elusive language of two people accustomed to concealment, of shares in the estate's timber sales that had never appeared in the official accounts, of an arrangement that had allowed Lady Seraphina to purchase her London bonnets and her fine new carriage on the strength of Ashcombe wood sold to a merchant in Bristol, whose name did not appear anywhere in the ledgers Eleanor had been permitted to see. It spoke, too, with a casual cruelty that made her hands go cold, of the Duke's usefulness in the matter, not his complicity, she understood upon a second and third reading, but his ignorance, his willingness to leave all such business in Vane's capable hands, his fond indifference that made the whole scheme so wonderfully easy to execute beneath his very roof. She copied the letter's contents into her own hand before returning the original, precisely to where she had found it, her fingers trembling only slightly, and she did not sleep that night at all. The revelation, once it had settled into her like a stone sinking through still water, changed something fundamental in Eleanor Winthrop Ashworth. She had spent 2 years making herself small, in the hope that smallness might one day earn her a measure of peace, or failing peace, at least safety. But she understood now, lying awake and staring at the canopy of a marriage bed her husband rarely shared, that smallness had bought her nothing at all. It had merely made her easier to rob, easier to mock, easier to overlook, while other, louder people helped themselves to what was rightfully hers to protect. For whatever her husband felt or did not feel for her, Ashcombe was her home now too, its tenants her responsibility, its future bound up with whatever children she might one day bear. She could not undo 2 years of silence in a single night. But she could, she decided, stop adding to it. The difficulty, of course, was proof of a kind that would stand against a steward's long service and a mistress's practised charm, proof that a duke, too indifferent to examine his own accounts, might none the less be persuaded to believe. A copied letter in a duchess's private hand would convince no one. It might easily be dismissed as fabrication, the jealous invention of a neglected wife. Eleanor understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent her girlhood watching her father's small parish disputes, resolved or ruined by the quality of evidence brought before the magistrate, that she required something no one could credibly deny. She began, with Mrs. Bramwell's quiet assistance, to build her case as methodically as she had once balanced her father's parish books. She visited, under cover of her charitable errands, every tenant family whose rents had lately been raised, and found among them 3 who were willing, cautiously, fearfully, but willing to put their marks to a written account of what Vane's agent had told them regarding the increases and why. She sought out, through a cousin of Mrs. Bramwell's employed in the Bristol timber trade, confirmation that a merchant there had indeed purchased Ashcombe wood at a price considerably below its worth, paid not to the estate, but to an account in Lady Seraphina's maiden name. She retrieved on a second visit to the estate office when she judged the risk worth taking, not the original letter, which she dared not remove, but a fresh copy made with painstaking care, and she pressed Mrs. Micker, Bramwell's nephew, a clerk of modest standing in the county town, into confirming that the hand-matched samples of Vane's known correspondence held at the local bank. It took the better part of 2 months. Twice she nearly lost her nerve. Once, when Vane's eye lingered on her a moment too long across the dinner table, she was certain she had been discovered, and spent a sleepless night composing and discarding a dozen possible confessions to her husband, none of which she trusted him to receive with anything but irritation. But she did not stop. Something had hardened in her since the night of the letter, some quiet banked fire that had not existed in the girl who married for her sister's sake, and had resolved ever since to ask for nothing and expect less. It was into this careful, silent campaign that the overheard conversation in the drawing-room fell like a spark onto dry tinder. She had gone to the drawing-room that rain-soaked evening, intending only to retrieve a shawl left there earlier in the day, not knowing her husband had returned early from the county assizes, nor that Lady Seraphina had been received in her own house with a boldness that suggested the woman no longer troubled herself to maintain even the thinnest pretense of discretion. She had heard the voices before she reached the door, and something in her, perhaps the 2 months of gathering proof, perhaps simply the accumulated weight of 2 years' quiet endurance, had made her stop rather than retreat, had made her listen rather than flee. A brood mare, nothing more. She stood in the corridor a long moment after the laughter faded, and when she finally moved, it was not toward her rooms, and it was not toward tears. It was toward the estate office, where her carefully assembled evidence waited in the locked drawer, and toward a decision she had, without quite realizing it, already made. She would not confront her husband in private, where his pride might harden into denial, and Vane might yet cover his tracks. She would not write him a letter, which he might set aside unread as he set aside so much else that did not amuse him. She understood with the particular cold precision of a woman who had spent 2 years studying exactly how her husband's attention could and could not be commanded, that Edmund Ashworth responded to spectacle, to the opinion of his peers, to the specific discomfort of being seen to be wrong in company he could not simply dismiss from the room. And so she began that very night to plan, not a scene but a reckoning, one stage with all the deliberate care Vane himself had used to steal from the estate for 2 long years, and time to land at the one moment her husband could neither ignore it nor contain it. The occasion presented itself within the fortnight. The autumn harvest dinner, an Ashcombe tradition older than the current Duke's grandfather, at which the county's principal families gathered alongside the estate's tenant farmers to mark the season's yield, and this year, at which the Dowager Duchess herself, Edmund's formidable mother, had announced her intention to be present, having been abroad in Bath for the better part of a year, and eager, she wrote, to see how her son's household fared in her absence. It could not have been better timed had Eleanor herself arranged the Dowager's return, though she had not. Providence, or something very like it, seemed at last to be lending her its assistance. The days leading to the harvest dinner passed for Eleanor in a strange, suspended calm. The calm of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for circumstances to improve and has instead set about improving them herself. She continued her outward routine exactly as before, the household accounts, the correspondence, the small charitable errands that had become her only real freedom, giving neither her husband nor Vane nor Lady Seraphina any reason to suspect that anything at all had changed. But in the locked drawer of her sitting-room, her case grew complete. The tenant statements, signed and witnessed, The Bristol merchant's confirmation, obtained through Mrs. Confirmation. Bramwell's discreet family connection, the copied letter, its contents transcribed twice more for safekeeping, and a final, careful accounting, drawn in Eleanor's own clear hand, of every discrepancy she had traced between the estate's true condition and the figures Vane had presented to the Duke across 6 years of unquestioned service. She showed none of it to anyone save Mrs. Bramwell, who alone knew the full shape of what her mistress intended, and who had watched the transformation in the young Duchess these 2 months past with something like awe. "You've the look of your father about you tonight, Your Grace," the housekeeper said quietly. The evening before the dinner, as she helped Eleanor lay out the papers in their proper order. The look he must have worn on the bench, deciding a case. "I hope I've more mercy than some magistrates I have known," Eleanor said. "But I confess, Mrs. Bramwell, I find I have considerably less patience than I once did." The Dowager Duchess arrived 3 days before the harvest dinner, and it was in her sharp, unsentimental company that Eleanor found, unexpectedly, her final and most valuable ally. The old woman had never been unkind to her daughter-in-law, precisely, but neither had she troubled to know her. Eleanor had assumed these 2 years that she was regarded by the Dowager much as she was regarded by everyone else at Ashcombe, a sensible, unremarkable arrangement, useful and unloved. It was, therefore, with some surprise that Eleanor found herself, on the second evening of the Dowager's visit, subjected to a long, penetrating study across the drawing-room fire, and then to a question she had not expected. "You have changed, Eleanor," the Dowager said, without preamble, in the manner of a woman long past the age of soft approaches. "You hold your head differently. What has happened?" Eleanor considered lying. She considered the safe, small answer that had served her for 2 years. And then, weighing the woman before her, shrewd, plainly unimpressed by her son's mistress, whom she had greeted at dinner the previous evening with a chill so absolute that Lady Seraphina had excused herself early, Eleanor made a decision that would prove, in the end, the decisive stroke of her whole campaign. She told her the truth. All of it. Vane's letter, the tenant testimonies, the timber sold beneath its worth, the accounts falsified for 6 years beneath her son's incurious eye, and, though it cost her more than any of the rest to say aloud, the conversation she had overheard in the drawing-room a fortnight past. Word for word, the Dowager Duchess listened without once interrupting, her face growing harder and stiller with every sentence, until by the end she sat entirely motionless, her hands folded in her lap, like a woman carved from marble. When Eleanor finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the fire's low collapse. "A broodmare," the Dowager said at last very quietly. "He called you a broodmare in his own house to that woman's face." She looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "My husband called me worse in his time, my dear, and to worse company. I did nothing. I told myself it was not my place, that a duchess's dignity lay in her silence." She rose, moving to the window, her back very straight. "I have watched you these 2 days, and I confess I believed you had learned the same lesson I did. That silence was safety. I am glad to find I was wrong. Tell me what you require of me, and you shall have it." What Eleanor required, as it transpired, was not very much, only the Dowager's presence at the harvest dinner, her willingness to remain seated rather than withdraw, should matters grow uncomfortable, and when the moment came, her voice added to Eleanor's own, for a duchess speaking alone might be dismissed as a jealous wife. But a duchess speaking with a Dowager Duchess at her side could not so easily be waved away. The harvest dinner at Ashcombe Hall had never, in living memory, drawn so full a table. The county's principal families sat alongside the Duke's own relations. The tenant farmers and their wives, by ancient custom, filled the lower tables nearer the doors, and Lady Seraphina Vane, seated by the Duke's private invitation at a position of prominence that raised more than one eyebrow among the assembled gentry. Held court in a gown considerably finer than the occasion warranted, laughing at something Edmund had murmured to her before the soup had even been cleared. Eleanor sat at the table's far end, in the place her husband's indifference had long ago assigned her, and ate almost nothing, and waited. She waited through the fish course and the roast, through the Duke's brief, dutiful toast to the season's harvest, delivered with the same detached courtesy he extended to every obligation he found tedious, through the murmur of conversation rising and falling around the long table like tide against a shore. She waited until the moment she had chosen with such care, not during the meal itself, when the shock of interruption might scatter into confusion, but immediately after. The Duke rose as tradition demanded, to receive the tenants' formal thanks for the season, a moment when every eye in the hall would naturally be fixed upon the head of the table. It was then that Eleanor rose as well. A duchess, rising unbidden, uninvited, to speak before her husband had properly yielded. The floor was so far outside the accepted order of such evenings that a hush fell over the hall before she had spoken a single word, the particular, electric hush of an audience that senses, before it fully understands, that it is about to witness something it will speak of for years. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and her voice, though quiet, carried the length of the hall with a clarity that surprised even her. "But before the tenants' thanks are received, I believe the tenants themselves are owed an explanation. One, I fear, has been kept from all of us, including my husband, for a great deal longer than any of us would wish." The Duke's expression, Eleanor would remember afterward, moved through several stages in the space of a heartbeat: confusion, faint irritation at the interruption to a tedious ritual he wished concluded, and then, as she continued, something closer to alarm. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep or accuse in the manner of a wronged wife seeking sympathy. She had considered and discarded that approach weeks before, understanding that it would cast her as pitiable rather than credible. And pity, however warranted, was not what she required tonight. Instead, she spoke as her father had once spoken from behind a parish desk, laying out facts in their proper order, each one supported by the last, her voice never rising above the measured tone of a woman reading an account she knew beyond any doubt to be true. She spoke of rents raised without the Duke's knowledge, and named the 3 tenant families whose signed statements she now produced from the small leather case Mrs. Bramwell had carried in for her and set upon the table. She spoke of timber sold to a Bristol merchant at a price far below its worth, the proceeds directed not into the estate's accounts, but into a private arrangement between the estate's steward and a lady of his acquaintance. And here, for the first time, a murmur broke across the hall for every soul present. Though Eleanor had not yet spoken her name, she spoke of 6 years of ledgers that did not match the estate's true condition, 6 years overseen by a steward who had assured his employer, again and again, that all was well, while helping himself, with his cousin's willing assistance, to what belonged to the house and its tenants both. Lady Seraphina had gone very white. Mr. B. Vane, seated some distance down the table among the estate's senior servants, had risen halfway from his chair before seeming to think better of it, his face draining of colour as swiftly as the wine had drained from his cup. "This is preposterous," he began, his voice cracking on the second word. "A jealous woman's fancy, nothing more. I had thought you might say something of the kind." "Vane," Eleanor said, and now she turned unhurried to lift the second document from her case. The merchant's letter, obtained through Mrs. Bramwell's connection, confirming the sale and the account into which payment had been directed, which is why I did not rely on my own word alone. The Duke had gone very still. Eleanor watched him read the merchant's letter as Mrs. Bramwell carried it the length of the table at her nod, watched his eyes move to the tenant statements, watched something in his face that she had never once seen there in 2 years of marriage. Not indifference, not boredom, not the mild, distant courtesy he extended to a wife he had never troubled to know. Have been called shame. Edmund, the Dowager Duchess's voice cut through the hall's rising murmur like a blade, and every head turned to where she sat, straight-backed, at her son's right hand. I have heard the whole of this account already from your wife's own lips 2 evenings past, and I have satisfied myself through my own inquiries this very day. Here she produced, to Eleanor's genuine surprise, a folded paper of her own. For the Dowager, it transpired, had spent the 2 days since their conversation making her own quiet confirmations among the household staff that every word of it is true. You will ask yourself, I think, why it required your wife to uncover in 2 months what your steward concealed from you across 6 years. I would ask you instead to consider why you never thought to look. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a great house's entire population, understanding all at once that the ground beneath 2 people's comfortable authority had just given way. It was Lady Seraphina who broke first, rising with a scrape of her chair that seemed unnaturally loud in the hush. I have been slandered before, an entire county on the word of a woman, with every reason to invent such a tale. I invented nothing, Lady Seraphina, Eleanor said, and for the first time that evening her voice held an edge, quiet but unmistakable. I have here a copy, made in my own hand and witnessed by my housekeeper, of a letter in Mr. Vane's own writing, addressed to you, discussing the arrangement in terms I will not repeat before this company, though I am perfectly prepared to read them aloud, should any soul at this table doubt me. She let the silence stretch a moment, watching the colour drain further from Lady Seraphina's face. I overheard something else, a fortnight past, that I have likewise not forgotten. But I did not come here tonight to repeat cruel words spoken of me in a private room. I came to speak of theft and falsified accounts, and tenants whose rents were raised to pay for another woman's London bonnets. That is a matter for magistrates, not merely for gossip, and I intend that it be treated as such. The Duke rose at last, slowly. As a man rises from water he has only just realized is far over his head. He looked at his steward, whose face had collapsed into something like a man already condemned. He looked at his mistress, standing rigid and furious, and, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, entirely without her practised charm. And then, at last, he looked at his wife, standing at the table's far end in the plain grey gown he had never once complimented, holding in her steady hands the proof of an injury he had never troubled himself to notice she might suffer, let alone remedy. "Vane," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the particular weight of a man whose comfortable blindness has just been stripped from him in front of every family whose good opinion he required. "You will remain in this house tonight under guard, and in the morning you will answer to the magistrate for what my wife has laid before this table. Lady Seraphina," and here something moved across his face that might have been the last dying flicker of the old careless affection, "you will leave Ashcombe grounds before morning, and you will not return." He did not look at Eleanor again that night, not directly, though she felt his gaze return to her again and again across the remainder of the evening, as the hall dissolved into the particular ordered chaos of a scandal breaking in real time, Footmen summoned, the magistrate's man sent for from the village. Vane led away white-faced and protesting between two grim-jawed grooms, Lady Seraphina departing in her fine carriage, with a haste that stripped away at last every pretence of dignity she had cultivated for 2 years. It was the Dowager Duchess who came to Eleanor's side once the worst of it had passed, taking her hand in a grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. "You did what I never had the courage to do, my dear, and you did it without raising your voice or shedding a single tear before that table. I begin to think my son has married considerably above his deserving." The investigation that followed in the weeks after the harvest dinner confirmed every particular of Eleanor's careful case, and uncovered, besides several irregularities she had not herself traced, a secondary account Vane had maintained, under a false name, small sums skimmed so cautiously across so long a span that no single year's ledger had ever shown enough discrepancy to draw an incurious eye. The magistrate, a stern, precise man, well acquainted with Eleanor's late father from their shared years on the county bench, remarked more than once in the course of the proceedings upon the unusual thoroughness of the evidence a duchess had somehow assembled without any legal training whatsoever, and Eleanor, pressed by more than one curious gentleman of the court as to how she had managed it, answered only that she had been raised to keep an honest set of books, and had never seen the sense in abandoning the habit merely because her circumstances had changed. Vane was tried and convicted of theft and fraud against the estate, his sentence, transportation, his name struck from every record of respectable employment in the county. Lady Seraphina, though no criminal charge could be brought against her directly for a lover's careless indiscretion, found herself excluded from every drawing-room of consequence within a 50-mile radius, the county's collective memory for scandal proving, and, within the year, she had removed herself to some distant relation's household in the north, never to trouble Ashcombe again. The Duke, for his part, underwent a transformation that surprised the household nearly as much as the scandal itself had done. He requested in the weeks following the harvest dinner that Eleanor instruct him personally in the estate's true accounts, not out of any performance of contrition, though contrition was plainly present, but out of a genuine halting curiosity that seemed, Eleanor thought, like a door long painted shut, finally creaking open. He began to seek her opinion on tenant matters he had once dismissed without a second thought. He began, too, to seek her company at dinner, not twice a month, but nearly every evening at first, in a silence that seemed to cost him some effort, and then, gradually, in conversation, hesitant at first, the conversation of a man relearning a language he had once known and long neglected, threaded through with a respect that had never once been present in the 2 years prior. "I called you nothing at all for 2 years," he said to her one evening in early winter, some months after the harvest dinner, as they sat together before the drawing-room fire in the very room where she had once overheard him call her a broodmare. "I never troubled to learn what you were, Eleanor, because I had decided, before ever I met you, that a sensible marriage required nothing of me but indifference. I'm ashamed to say how comfortable I found that indifference until the evening you proved to an entire county that I had married a woman considerably wiser than the man who took her for granted." "You are not required to say any of this to me, Edmund," Eleanor said, though something in her chest had gone soft and unguarded at his words, in a way she had not permitted herself in a very long time. "I am not required to," he agreed. "I find, rather to my own surprise, that I wish to." He was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "I do not ask your forgiveness tonight. I have not yet earned it, but I should like, if you would permit it, to begin trying." Eleanor Ashworth, who had married a stranger to save her sisters from ruin, and had spent 2 years making herself as small and as silent as her circumstances demanded, looked at her husband across the firelight, and found to her own quiet astonishment that she believed him. The years that followed Ashcombe's reckoning were not without their ordinary difficulties. No marriage mended overnight is without its awkward silences, its relapses into old habit, its slow, halting work of two people learning, very late, to actually see one another. But they were years. Mrs. Bramwell would often remark to the younger housemaids in the years that followed, in which Ashcombe Hall grew warmer by every measure that mattered. The tenant rents were restored to their proper sums, and a new steward, recommended by the county magistrate himself, and answerable at Eleanor's quiet insistence, jointly to the Duke and Duchess both, kept books that any honest clerk could audit at a moment's notice. The Dowager Duchess took up regular residence at Ashcombe rather than Bath, declaring that she found the company considerably improved, and spent many contented afternoons instructing her granddaughter, for a daughter came to Eleanor and Edmund within 2 years of the harvest dinner, followed by a son some years after. The particular pleasures of a well-kept ledger. Eleanor herself, in time, became known across the county not merely as a duchess who had exposed a great fraud, but as a woman whose counsel on estate matters, charitable works, and the education of tenant children was sought as readily as her husband's, and given as freely. She never spoke publicly, in all the years that followed, of the conversation she had overheard in the drawing-room that rainy autumn evening, nor of the 2 months of quiet, unglamorous work that had followed it, the tenant visits, the copied letters, the sleepless nights weighing evidence against risks. She had never required an audience for that part of the story. The audience she had wanted, in the end, had been a single evening's worth, gathered at a long table on a night of harvest Thanksgiving, and it had been more than sufficient. What she told her own daughter, years later, when the girl asked why her mother kept such careful books, and insisted, over her tutor's mild objections, on learning every figure of the estate's accounts herself, rather than trusting them to any steward, however well recommended, was simply this, that a woman who is called nothing will remain nothing for as long as she permits the world to think so. But a woman who keeps her own accounts, in every sense the word allows, need never again wonder whether the truth will be there to meet her when at last she requires it. It was not, perhaps, the sort of moral one found in the romances Eleanor had read as a girl by candlelight. But it was, she had found, considerably more useful, and considerably more true, and it was the only inheritance beyond Ashcombe's restored fortune that she ever truly wished to leave behind.